All right. My name is Cami Sharrat, and it is currently November 26th, 2016 at 8:11 p.m. And I am interviewing Julie Kelley at her home in Savage, Minnesota. So, we're just gonna get started. What was your home life like when you were growing up? Did your parents talk about worldly issues during your childhood?
All the time. My dad would come home from work and turn on the news at 5:30, and that was the CBS News with Walter Cronkite, who was a very famous guy. And as long as I can remember, um, I don't know if you want me to talk about this yet, but the Vietnam War was always on the news because I was like 9 or 10 when it started being on the news. So it was a big part of my childhood, but we always watched the news. We always talked about what was going on in the world at the dinner table.
Did your
So,
parents express opinions about like what they like their political ideations, their opinions of the president, whatnot?
yeah, yeah, from as long as I can remember. I remember when Kennedy was assassinated, and what was that, 63, and my dad just being glued to the television and how upset he was. And that was in the early 60s. But what I remember really is the TV always being on with the news on. And it wasn't like now. There were no 24-hour news channels where you could, listen 24/7 to the news. It was really like a maybe half hour, an hour a day, and we'd always watch the 10 o'clock news too, which was local news. So, and then after that, he would go to bed. But news was always on, and we always got newspapers. And yeah, he gave opinions. He gave opinions about what he thought about everything.
Mm-hmm. Um, what was your dad's like profession?
My dad was a Air Force colonel. Well, he was an Air Force officer, and well, as long as I can remember, he was always a colonel. But that was the last 10 years when I really started paying attention to things. I remember him being a colonel, but obviously he was a lower rank when I was born.
Mm-hmm.
But he was in the Air Force for 30 years, starting in well, he was in World War II, and then he came home, and then he re-upped in like 46 or 47. So, and then he did that till he retired in 1972.
What was your education like? What was your education about history and current political issues like?
When I was in high school or college or,
Middle school, high school, college, whenever.
well, I don't remember learning much at all um, in elementary school. I went to a Catholic school through 8th grade, and I don't remember really talking much about politics at all and that. And then from ninth through 12th grade, um, well, that was my the most important thing was, well, there was Nixon, there was Johnson, there was President Johnson, President Nixon. The Vietnam War was so big in my life. It was what I remember growing up. Um, but in high school, I don't remember talking about current events. We had U.S. history, world history, but I don't remember talking about current history. What was going on in the White House or overseas
Hmm.
ever in high school.
Interesting. Um, how interested were you in pursuing a career in like assisting and working for the United States? Like, was there someone in your life that inspired you to like serve and support your country?
I mean, when I went to the Air Force,
Mm-hmm.
well, my dad was in the Air Force, so it was always part of my life being in the Air Force until I was 18. Always moving, being, I'd go to we only lived on base once in those first 18 years, and that was when we lived in Hawaii. But the base was always part of my going to the base, going to the exchange on base, going to the what did they call it? There was a name for it. With a grocery store, we'd go. I'd go with my mom often, and I'd always see soldiers walking around. Like, I lived near Lowry Air Force Base, and that was a big training center when I was growing up. So I remember that a lot. When I lived in Hawaii, there were soldiers everywhere. These were airmen. But the reason I went into the Air Force was to travel. That was my main goal. I really didn't think too much about serving my country. I wasn't against it, but I was a little scared of the commitment because I knew I'd have to stay in 4 years, and that scared me a little bit. But I wasn't really thinking at all about service. I'd come back from Spain where I'd lived for a year. I was an au pair girl, and I came home. I went back to school for a semester, and then I got to go back. I'm not done traveling in my life. And I think my mom even mentioned going into the service. And do you want to know how I joined the service? You want to know what?
Yeah.
Well, I used to take. Sometimes I would drive down I went to the University of Colorado at Denver, which is in downtown Denver, and sometimes I took the bus down. And on my way down, there was a Air Force recruiting station. I think it was on Colfax Avenue in Denver, and I would drive by it. I'd take the bus down, and then one day I just got off the bus. I planned to get off the bus, and I went in there, and I said, I just want to go to Europe. That was my goal. And he said, well, we have the job for you. So.
Oh, my God.
Do you want me to continue or
No,
just?
if you want to, otherwise. It's okay.
Shall I continue?
No, it's
Okay.
Were there active conversations about Vietnam prior to open acknowledgement of the war amongst your classmates or employees or parents or teachers?
Well, you know, when the war ended, I was 18. So this was all my high school and middle school years. We didn't call it middle school back then, but you know, it was just a fact of life. We didn't talk about it too much. We were too busy being teenagers. We didn't think too much of it. It was always on television. And like I said, my dad always watched the news. Mm-hmm. And although when I was in high school, I often didn't get home in time to see the news with him. So it became less of my life. But he was in Hawaii, which was kind of midway between the U.S. mainland and Vietnam. And he went over there once.
To Vietnam?
Yeah, just to, he was old he was almost 50. Well, he was 52 when he retired from the Air Force. So during Vietnam, he was in his late 40s, he was in his 40s and 50s. And he went over there he was a lawyer. He was the JAG, the Judge Advocate General. And he went over there to investigate an airman who refused to cut his hair. And it was just so weird. Yeah, he went over I don't know if that was the only reason, but I remember him going there for just a few days. He was never saw any danger or anything.
That seems a bit excessive.
Well, maybe
for
there's
just
more to this.
Cutting hair.
Well, I don't know. But I remember there was a story in the newspaper, in the Honolulu Star, or whatever the name of just a little blurb in there. But yeah, my memories are kind of vague about exactly what happened and why he went. But I remember that's the only time he went to Vietnam. So.
That is so interesting. What were you doing prior to the war starting or prior to your awareness about the war?
Well, I guess I became aware of the war when I was about 11 or 12. So that was like 1966, 67. But I just was going to school. I lived in different places. Can you excuse me for 1 second? I gotta turn down the soup. Okay. What was the question about, like, where I lived, or?
What were you doing prior to the war starting, or prior to your awareness about the war?
I was just a kid. I was just a kid in elementary school. I remember mainly in Colorado, when we were living in Colorado. That's my biggest memories of the war, up until about 8th grade.
Okay. What was your understanding of why the U.S. was involved in Vietnam? Especially at such a young age.
Because we got to beat the commies. That was it. We were scared of the communists back then. And we thought they were bad, and North Vietnam was the communists. They were backed by the Soviet Union, and we always thought the Soviet Union was the bad guy. And that's what I understood about it.
How did you, interpret, how did you understand communists? What did you think communists were?
Well, we kind of thought that they wanted to take over the world. That was the domino theory, that if one country fell, another country would fall, and the Soviet Union wanted North Vietnam, and then if they fell, then the rest of Asia would fall, and eventually the United States would fall, and that's how we thought of communism, is just wanting to take over the world. That's...
How quickly did your community, your household or your friends, start expressing opinions about the war?
We didn't really talk about it too much. We didn't. Kids weren't as aware. And remember, I was in high school when it ended. I was a senior in high school. I think most of us at my age just grew up with it, and we thought it was like the normal state of events that the United States would be at war.
So kind of like how my generation views the wars in the Middle East.
You guys are much more aware of what's going on in the world, and partly because we didn't have the mass communication. We didn't have social media. We had 4 TV channels. I guess if I'd been a little older and some of my friends or had gone to Vietnam, because I was just like a year short of having my friends go to Vietnam, maybe it would have meant a little bit more to me.
What was your initial reaction to when the war was getting started, when stuff started happening in Vietnam? Did you react at all to it?
I was too young.
Did your father react at all to it?
No. He didn't talk about it in our house. I don't know when it started. Was it in the mid-60s it really got started? That's the thing. I'm not really sure.
There wasn't a clear commencement date.
Well, we didn't ever declare war because
No.
we just supported the South Vietnamese. So there was never any, that we just got more and more involved in Vietnam. We sent more and more troops.
So would you say that there was an emotion you felt during the beginning of the war, or would you say that it was just completely
the beginning
the
of the
same?
war, the time I became aware of the war might be different, because
What about then?
I used to watch Walter Cronkite, with my dad, the CBS Evening News. And at the very end of the broadcast, they would talk about Vietnamese casualties, the North Vietnamese. What are they? The Viet Cong, they call them, I think. And then American casualties, and they'd say how many were killed or wounded. And of course, the Viet Cong always had a higher number. That's what we were told. But I always was very sad, because they would say 20 Americans were killed in action today, or something like that. I don't remember the exact words. And I always was sad. So that was my main emotion, about just it's never going to end. This is going to have to continue forever and ever. I was really sad about it. And I never really thought too much that they were fighting the commies, although that's what our purpose was, we thought. But I was more sad about everyone who was killed. But I wasn't sad about the Viet Cong. I thought they were the bad guys. Sad.
How did you learn about or receive information about the war? How did that change your perspective?
Mainly the news on television. And again, how did it change my perspective of the war? It was probably a little biased. I mean, it was pro-American, but it wasn't overtly pro-American. It was just, it sounded like we were winning, I think, all the time. It didn't sound like we had too many failures, if I am remembering correctly. So I didn't read the newspaper much then. I mean, it was there and I'd look at the headlines, but I didn't read it much. I mean, I read the varieties, the home section and Ann Landers and stuff. But I didn't read them.
So, I guess you kind of answered this already, but like, tell me about your experiences during the Vietnam War. What did you do during it? Go to school.
I went to school. But I do remember the last year of the war fairly well. And that's when I was a senior in high school.
So tell me about that specific experience from the Vietnam War.
So we had moved back to Colorado. We had moved from Hawaii back to Colorado. My dad had retired in 1972. Gosh, and I hope I'm correct, but I think the war kind of ended in 73 with the Paris peace talks, and that we were always, the years prior to the end of the war, we were always hopeful. They always said they had talks, but it never seemed to come to fruition. But that last year was my senior year, and I remember being more hopeful. And then they had these Paris peace talks. Was it Harry Kissinger? Was he in it? And they showed these pictures in Paris of guys coming in and out of the buildings. But I remember one day sitting, my mom and I went on an errand, and she was doing something inside somebody's house. She went to pick up something, and I was sitting in our Volkswagen listening to the radio about, and that's where another way I got my information from, the radio. AM radio, not FM. Not that that matters, but and them talking about the war being over, that they had come to an accord, and I was like, I can't believe this. I can't believe it's over. So I really, despite not caring much about the everyday aspects of war, I did care that it seemed to be over, although everyone kind of like didn't really believe it. So I think that was 1973. I do remember more after the war, but I don't know if you want me to talk about that.
No, go ahead.
So I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder after my senior year, so that was 1973, and I stayed there for a couple of years. But in 1974-75 year, I lived in a house with 3 other girls, and one of them was Vietnamese. And I remember in 1975, so this was supposed to be some kind of an agreement, the Paris peace talks, and I really don't know any of the details about who got what or what the accord was. But in 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese. And I remember all those photos of people being on top of the embassy and flying out on the helicopters, but my college roommate told me that her father, who she hadn't seen in years and years, had fought for the North Vietnamese, and she had finally heard from him. But I remember she was a graduate student, and it was in May, I think, and I just remember her trying to get all her classes done and worrying about the end of the, with Saigon falling to the North Vietnamese, or whatever they call themselves now. I don't even know. and about her father. I remember that really well. And I was worried about her and what I thought about was, how's she going to finish her classes? She's going to be worried too much. I wasn't worried about her dad or anything. I was worried that she wouldn't be able to finish her classes because she was worried about Vietnam.
Did you ever find out what happened?
No, I didn't. Because that summer she moved. I left school. I didn't go back to the University of Colorado, and I never saw her again. Isn't that sad?
That is sad.
Yeah.
So would you say that the sitting in your car and talking to her were your most vivid memories of that time period, or was there another experience that?
I kind of those are my two biggest personal memories. I remember when Kent State happened, kind of. Do you know what Kent State was? Kids were killed by the National Guard, and I kind of remember that. But back then, I thought people who opposed the war were kind of bad guys. And I didn't think bad things, but now I look back on it and I'm like, these were just college kids, and they may have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they were just killed. And the National Guard guys were probably terrified too. So I kind of remember that too, and that photo, that famous photo of a girl looking up from her friend's dead body.
Do you remember hearing about the My Lai massacre?
Yeah, but I don't know when. I do, but I don't know. I remember was he a major or something? He was in charge of his unit, and he was told to do something. I can't remember all the details.
Yeah. Well, it was just the event that happened where the American troops took out a ton of people in this village, a lot of women and children and old people that were
Did they kill
innocent.
them?
Yeah, they killed them.
Yeah, I don't remember the details.
Well, that's awkward.
It's a little awkward.
Kidding. So was there a changed atmosphere after the war ended of people around you, or was your life pretty much the same?
My life was pretty much the same. Yeah, and I was too young, I think, to appreciate the guys who came back, or to realize what they were going through. Although I knew one guy when I was a senior in high school, he had flown helicopters. I met him at the dry cleaners where I worked. But he didn't really talk about it. No, it didn't change my life that much. It did more as I got older, you know?
How so?
I think about how sad that war was. But what's interesting is my dad, who was the Air Force officer during the war, and he retired a year before the end of the war. He later told me, he said, I think the war was wrong. We were wrong being there. And you know what? I think I'm going to have to buy a book or something, and maybe you can tell me about the war. How it all started, and how it... And I'm so dumb, I don't really know much about our history.
You're not dumb.
No, but I don't know much about our history, but now I look back on it and I think of all the people who lost their lives, and both, North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese and civilians, and our young men who lost their life. And yeah, I remember what I remember about the Vietnam War was the draft. And I remember once my birthday was super close to number 7. I mean, because we always looked at the draft numbers, and the birthdays would come out. Did you know they did it by birthdays? And it was like a lottery? Well, it was like they drew birthdays, and if you were born May 19th, then you might be picked 200, but mine was really close to the top, and I was thinking, well, I'm lucky I'm a woman, and I'm also too young. I think I was 17 when I remember that. But I thought, and people could get, if you were in college, you could get a waiver. It was really unfair to people who couldn't either afford college or didn't want to go to college. That's the worst. There were so many injustices back then. Now, yeah, I think now that I look back on it, but you know what? You know what affected my life?
Hmm.
I've always thought about this. And from as long as I can remember until I was 18, we were always at war. I don't remember
Hmm.
us not being at war as a child. Same with you, yeah, Cam, because we've always been at war in your life, and it was the same. And I remember the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. It was like to me it was a time of peace because we weren't at war. Because my first 18 years of life, we were involved in a war and people were getting killed. The United States was involved in a war. That's what I remember my early part of my life being.
It sucks.
It does. Yeah, I never even thought about it with you because we're kind of in the same situation. We're not really at war. We've never declared war on anybody, but our men are fighting there, men and women. Back when I was young, no women went to war. We weren't allowed to.
Feminism.
Yeah. I remember other things,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know if you want me to talk about that.
No, go
later.
ahead.
You know what I remember really well?
What?
This was years later after the war. But what year was this? It was 1983. Early 1980. It was like spring, like March or something. I was taking intelligence class down in Warrenton, Virginia. It was a CIA school. And I was learning how to do stuff in my intelligence job. And there was four of us. We became really good friends down there. We lived there during the week, and then we went home to our homes on the weekends because a lot of us lived far away. And one day, it was like 5 o'clock in the evening. We were like, it was when we said, let's go into D.C. and see the new Vietnam War Memorial. And it had just been shown. I don't even know if it had officially been, what is the right word? Introduced to the public, open to the public. But we went down to the mall at where it is.
Mm-hmm.
And have you ever seen it, Kimmy?
We went.
Oh, did we? But anyway, we went down there and it was all dark. It wasn't lit up then. And we were like, where is this thing? And all of a sudden we came and it was dark out. By the time we got there, it was like 7 or 8 at night. And it was dark. So, and it's a black memorial.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, we couldn't find it. And all of a sudden we kind of stumbled on it. And we saw this black wall, which wasn't lit up. I don't even know if it's lit up now at night, but it was. And we just walked along it, the four of us, and we were all probably in our late 20s, 30s. So we had all lived through the war. And I remember just walking on it and feeling the names, because you couldn't really see the names, because you could kind of make out that there were names there, but it was too dark to really read them.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember we were just so sad, all of us, seeing 50,000 names, whatever it is, on that wall. I just remember it was really one of the coolest moments of my life with my friends. And after that, we went to a restaurant. We were just so subdued. And we were like, that was the coolest thing we've ever seen, and it was so much part of our lives. And some of those people were old enough to have fought in it. I don't think they did. There were 2 guys and 2 girls, so the girls wouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that moment.
That's cool.
Yes.
If you could explain the war in one word, what would the word be? And can you elaborate on why you chose that word?
Sad.
Just that?
Sad. I don't even look back on whether it was just or unjust, because I think at the time you respond to the world as you know it at that time. And we did think the communists were bad, and we did think they wanted to destroy our way of living. I was sad during the war because all I heard about were people getting killed, and they were so often young men, in their teens, 20s. But in retrospect, that's how I sum it up. I don't think anyone was good or bad. I just think the loss of life and how it changed the poor Vietnamese who were just innocent people in all this. So many of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they just wanted to live their life and be farmers or whatever. And their life was destroyed at that time. So,
Sad.
sad.
Um, how did, like, your community react to the end of the war? And what were their opinions on the government and military in Vietnam after the war ended?
I don't remember. I don't think it was a big thing. Because I went to college. I'm just trying to remember if there were any protests where I was before the war ended, but there weren't in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember any big change in my life or the community. My community after the end of the war was the University of Colorado at Boulder, and there were, I guess, the protests were over at that point. And I don't remember young men coming home and being disrespected. I don't remember any of that. So I don't remember our community acting any differently.
So it all just seemed very peaceful?
It kind of did. I remember my sisters went to the University of Colorado before the end of the war. They were there a year before me. And I remember there were riots then and in downtown Boulder. But I don't know if it was, I guess it was against the war. With, windows getting broken in stores, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Did this war result in tensioning of relationships with foreign countries? If yes, how so? If not, how were the relationships improved?
Boy, that's a tough one. You would have had to have been paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
Improved? I think, what happened after the war?
Did the United States get along better with other countries, or?
No. I think there was a lot of, after the war, I know Cambodia, I don't know about Thailand, a lot of those countries were affected by the war, and we had a lot of operatives in Cambodia, is that right? I know about Thailand, and I think their worlds suffered because of that. Do you know that the president of Cambodia, when we were in Vietnam, I think he left in the early 70s, and he was kind of, he allowed the United States to be in Cambodia to go after Vietnamese, I guess, the North Vietnamese. And I remember Lon Nol living in a little house near our house, and we'd walk by, and sometimes he'd be sitting outside. It was a teeny little duplex that they...
Wait, the guy that was the previous leader?
He was allowed to live on Hickam Air Force Base.
Cambodia.
Yes. And I remember my dad pointing him out, that's Lon Nol, and maybe I'm making this up, but... And I remember occasionally there was a little old guy sitting, I don't think he was in very good health at that point. I think his family ended up coming to Hawaii, but...
What?
Yeah, it's true. He was given not asylum, but he left. And I think, is that when the Khmer Rouge took over? Anyway, I have these vague memories of him. But that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, huh?
No, it's interesting.
But it was, yeah. There was a teeny little duplex. We lived in military housing. And it was usually younger officers would live there, but they had taken half of it. Maybe they took the whole duplex, and he lived there. It was a tiny house. It wasn't very nice. But he was always in the backyard sitting in the sun. And we'd walk up to the swimming pool on base, and there he'd be sitting there.
Did you ever talk to him?
No. We're not, I think there may have been bodyguards there. He was protected. But it was such a quiet, I don't think anyone really knew he existed, except my dad told me.
Huh. That's so weird.
It is.
Um, do you believe that you as an individual changed over the progression of the war?
The progression?
Yeah, from like when you were younger to when you were older and
Well,
it
I mean,
ended.
from when it's no, well, I guess I did, but it was my childhood. You don't change much when you're
Well, I mean,
11 to 18.
you do change when you're
Do
11 to
you?
18.
I was glad it was over. I think when I was younger, it was just something I accepted, and then when I got to be 18, it was like, this has got to end soon. It's just got to end.
Do you think that you would have like been a different person though if you would have grown up without the war?
I think we're always affected by what's going on around us. Yeah. Um,
um, what do you think we could have done differently?
in Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
you can't look at history like that. You can't. Pulled out sooner. Um, that's all. That's all I can think of. You can't change history. History isn't written like that. You do what you know is best at that time, or um, it would have been nice if we had left earlier. And I think by the time the war was over, everyone knew they were fighting a losing battle. It was a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think you can ever look at things like that.
For any history?
History is history. What about, yeah, I always think of like Hitler. What if somebody had assassinated him in 1939? How would the world be different?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you wouldn't exist. My father never would have been in World War II. He never would have met my mom. I mean, that's, you know, things like that. History is history.
Did they meet in World War II?
Well, he met because he was in the Air Force.
Huh.
He met her after he re-upped.
Hmm.
And her father was stationed at the same base. So things, it changes the course of everybody's life. Maybe we all wouldn't exist. We'd be different people.
Mm-hmm. Um, what lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time in history?
That things aren't always what they appear to be. To not go to war lightly. That's, who am I to tell other people?
Well, I mean, for you personally. I mean,
Yeah, when I was young, I always thought I believed what my dad knew. My dad was a very wise person, but he was affected by his view of the world and having been in World War II and fighting the communists. But I think there's always more than what you hear. Why are we in the Middle East right now? Or why are we in Afghanistan and wherever else we're at? Why are we fighting other people's wars? Why are we, I don't ever blame anyone, though, for making decisions that in retrospect weren't the best. Unless they're evil. I'll never forgive Hitler.
what did you think of LBJ?
What do I think of LBJ? I think he wanted to get out of Vietnam. I think he was a very brave man for not running again for president. I think became president. I think Kennedy wanted to get out of Vietnam, and then LBJ was caught in this escalating war. I don't think it's as easy as you think.
Mm-hmm. Have your views on war changed over time?
I think we should avoid war at all costs. It's never good for anybody. Unless we're defeating evil people like Hitler. But I'm more, it can never, there's no good in war, nothing. And when I was young, I used to think we were fighting the commies. It really does come down to that. You don't know what it was like to grow up during that era. You really thought the Soviet Union was the bad guy. It's so weird. Really, they were our arch enemies.
How did the Vietnam War affect how you view today's war on terrorism, if at all?
Well, in a sense, I guess in Vietnam we had a kind of a defined enemy that we thought of them as the North Vietnamese, but it was really the Soviet Union, not the Russians, but the Soviet Union, the communists. Um, the war on terrorism, there's less of a defined enemy. I mean, they're a defined enemy, but they're not located anywhere specific. But I do think that in the Vietnam War, we wasted so many lives for nothing. And that's why I don't want to see us go into war again.
Even though we're already in a war?
Well, we're not. But that's kind of human nature. Not that it's good. We are in a war, but we're not. We don't have a official enemy. Well, ISIS, I guess, is our enemy. That's the number one enemy.
So, like, if you don't, and this isn't meant to be a question that's like attacking at all, but like if you don't think like war isn't the answer or whatever, how would you suggest like fighting off someone like ISIS?
Well, I guess I bend my rules a little bit, but I think we take them out at all costs. But I think a lot of the issues are with, well, this is going to sound, I think a lot of the problems come with a marginalization of young Muslim youth, whether it's in France or in the United States. I think they do breed some. I think Saudi Arabia has a group of young men who are taught that this is the way to go. I don't think they're faultless, but I do think we're intolerant. I think they're intolerant of us. I think we're intolerant of them.
I guess that's really all of the questions that I have, considering my final question would be if you could go back and change what your involvement in the war was, would you? But you would answer no because you can't change history and also because you were young. Probably shouldn't be making assumptions because that's not what an oral historian should do. Oh God, now that's on recording. But yeah, that's really all the questions I have for you. So, thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was a good interview.
Yeah, I didn't know a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Woohoo.